The panicked barking of his German Shepherd sent former Navy SEAL Ethan Calder running deep into the frozen forest in the middle of the night. Beneath the heavy snow, a tiny puppy was trembling, nearly frozen to death, crying out with the last strength it had left.
Easy there,
Ethan had
little guy.
no idea that the moment he picked that puppy
now.
up, the secret he buried 5 years ago would begin to return. Strange signals in the forest, an injured mother dog disappearing into the darkness, and a hidden system that was never truly shut down. The deeper Ethan goes into Brightwater Ridge, the more he realizes some mistakes can never be completely erased. If you believe God sometimes sends miracles in the smallest forms, comment where you're watching from tonight. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and help us reach 1,000 followers so we can continue sharing more meaningful stories. Now, let's begin. The snow in Brightwater Ridge never fell violently. It drifted, soft, quiet, endless. By late January, the entire northern valley looked as though some ancient god had pulled a white wool blanket across the mountains and decided the world deserved silence for a while. Pine trees stood frozen beneath heavy powder. The lake beyond the ridge reflected pale morning light like cracked silver glass. Even the wind moved carefully here, threading itself through the forest in long, cold breaths. Ethan Calder preferred it that way. Silence was easier than people. At 35, Ethan carried the kind of stillness that only came after years of violence. He stood a little over 6 feet tall, lean and compact rather than bulky, with the disciplined posture of someone whose muscles had spent years obeying commands before thoughts. His face was clean-shaven, exposing the sharp structure of his jaw and the weathered angles beneath his cheekbones. Dark brown hair sat cropped close in an old military style, slightly longer than regulation now that nobody was left to correct him. Northern winters had roughened his fair skin into something harder, touched permanently by wind and cold. His gray-blue eyes rarely showed much emotion at first glance, but people who looked too long usually stopped talking afterward. There was something behind them that suggested he had seen too much and survived anyway. Beside him moved Ranger. The 6-year-old German Shepherd padded silently through the snowdrifts with practiced confidence. Cream-gray fur mixed with darker black markings along his back and ears, giving him the appearance of a wolf carved from winter ash. A black harness with deep muted red trim wrapped around his chest, slightly worn from years of use. His amber eyes missed very little. Man and dog walked the eastern trail shortly after sunrise, their boots and paws cutting fresh lines through untouched snow. Ethan adjusted the strap of the old rifle slung across his shoulder, not because he expected trouble, but because old habits never fully died. Every morning he and Ranger checked the trails surrounding Brightwater Ridge. Fallen trees, ice fractures, lost hikers, broken weather stations. The town sheriff jokingly called it Ethan's unofficial patrol. Ethan never corrected him. It gave structure to the days, and structure kept ghosts manageable. The forest was unusually calm that morning. Too calm, maybe. Ranger slowed first. Ethan noticed the shift immediately. The German Shepherd's ears angled forward. His gait shortened, and then he stopped entirely. "What is it?" Ethan asked quietly. Ranger didn't look at him. The dog stared toward the dense eastern pines. A thin gust of wind slid through the trees, carrying something Ethan couldn't yet identify. Not blood, not smoke. Fear. Ranger suddenly stepped off the trail. Ethan sighed under his breath. "If this is another squirrel, I swear to God." But the dog was already moving fast. Snow crunched sharply beneath Ethan's boots as he followed through the trees. Ranger weaved between narrow trunks with increasing urgency until Ethan finally spotted them. Tiny tracks. Dog tracks. Very small. They staggered unevenly across the snow like a creature that had already collapsed several times trying to stay alive. Ethan crouched low. Puppy. His chest tightened immediately, and the tracks led downhill toward a cluster of frozen brush near an old maintenance ditch buried beneath snow. Ranger reached it first and froze. Then Ethan saw the shape. Small, curled, barely moving. Oh no. The puppy looked no older than 8 or 10 weeks. A German Shepherd mix with pale cream-gray fur, soaked through and stiffened by ice. Snow clung around its nose and eyes. Its tiny body trembled weakly, muscles failing beneath exhaustion and cold. One ear twitched when Ethan approached. That was all the strength it had left. Ranger lowered himself beside the puppy without hesitation, carefully nudging it with his muzzle. The puppy made a faint sound, not even a whimper, more like breath catching against pain. Ethan pulled off his gloves. The puppy was freezing, not cold. Freezing. His military instincts took over immediately. He shrugged out of his outer coat, wrapped the trembling animal carefully against his chest, and felt how dangerously light it was beneath the soaked fur. Then he noticed something strange. Warm air, very faint, rising from somewhere below the snow. Ethan looked toward the frozen ditch nearby and saw rusted metal partially buried beneath ice. A vent shaft. Old infrastructure. Heat was still coming through it. What the hell? The puppy must have crawled from there. Ranger suddenly turned toward the trees again, body tense, not aggressive, alert. Watching. Ethan followed his gaze, but saw nothing except snow drifting lazily between pines. Still, the feeling settled into his spine anyway, like something unseen had just barely missed them. By the time they reached the cabin, the puppy had nearly stopped shivering. That scared Ethan more. The cabin sat near the ridge overlooking Brightwater Lake, built from old timber darkened by decades of snowstorms. Smoke curled from the chimney, while winter light spilled across the porch in pale gold ribbons. Normally, the place felt isolated in a peaceful way. That morning, it felt too far from town. Ethan kicked the door open with his boot. Easy, buddy. Easy. Ranger stayed close, while Ethan moved quickly through the familiar emergency rhythm. Fire stoked, blankets warmed, towels heated near the stove. The puppy barely reacted, while Ethan dried the frozen fur. Tiny ribs, weak heartbeat, severe hypothermia. Come on, Ethan muttered softly. Stay with me. The puppy's eyes opened briefly. Brown, young, terrified. And then Ethan saw it. A faint pressure mark around the puppy's neck, not from a normal collar. Something tighter, more industrial. And before Ethan could think further, the puppy's breathing hitched sharply. Ranger immediately moved closer. The German Shepherd lay beside the blankets, pressing warmth carefully against the tiny body. His amber eyes stayed fixed on the puppy with unusual intensity. Ranger had always been intelligent, but Ethan had learned long ago there were moments when the dog seemed to understand things no training could explain. This was one of them. The storm rolled in after dark. Not a blizzard, but enough snow and wind to close the lower ridge roads temporarily. Ethan tried calling the veterinary clinic, but cell service kept failing. Finally, he managed to reach Dr. Clara Whitmore through an emergency rescue radio frequency. Her voice crackled through static. Describe the gums. Pale? Breathing? Shallow? Slowing? A pause. Don't overheat him, Clara warned. Slow warming only. Keep the chest warm first. Tiny amounts of water. If he crashes, rub the sternum lightly. Don't force food yet. Ethan listened carefully. Dr. Clara Whitmore had worked veterinary rescue across northern states for nearly 15 years. At 41, she carried the composed exhaustion of someone who had spent too much of life fighting death in small, fragile bodies. She was tall for a woman, with pale, winter-worn skin, intelligent gray-brown eyes, and dark hair usually tied low behind her neck in practical impatience. People trusted her because she never dramatized suffering. She simply stood in front of it until it backed down, or until it won. Tonight, Ethan prayed she would be right again. Hours passed slowly. The puppy worsened before midnight. Its shivering stopped completely. Ethan's stomach dropped. No, no, no! He wrapped fresh, warm towels around the tiny body while Ranger pressed closer, refusing to move. The puppy barely breathed now. The cabin grew quieter. Outside, snow whispered against the windows. Inside, Ethan sat on the wooden floor beside the fire, with the puppy cradled carefully in his hands, exhaustion settling into his bones like wet cement. He had seen men die in colder places than this, men bigger, stronger, men trained for survival. And somehow, the possibility of losing this tiny animal hurt in a way he hadn't expected. Maybe because it was innocent, maybe because Ranger cared, or maybe because Ethan was tired of death arriving quietly. Around 2 a.m, Ranger suddenly lifted his head, not toward the door, toward the floor. The German Shepherd stood abruptly and moved across the cabin to the far wall near the storage shelves. A low growl vibrated deep in his throat, not hostile, but deeply unsettled. Ethan frowned. What is it? Ranger placed one paw against the wooden floorboards. Then again, tap, tap, tap. Like he heard something underneath the cabin. Ethan held still. For a moment, through the silence and wind outside, he thought he heard it too. A faint vibration, distant, mechanical. Then it vanished. Ranger slowly backed away from the wall, fur slightly raised. The puppy stirred weakly in Ethan's arms immediately afterward, as if whatever sound had passed beneath them had reached him too. And for the first time that night, Ethan stopped believing this was simply a lost puppy in the snow. Near dawn, exhaustion finally blurred the edges of Ethan's vision. Ranger still refused to sleep. The big German Shepherd remained beside the blankets, occasionally nudging the puppy whenever its breathing became too shallow. Then finally, a stronger inhale, small, fragile, but real. The puppy twitched beneath the blankets and released the weakest little sound Ethan had ever heard. Relief hit so suddenly, Ethan laughed under his breath. Yeah, he whispered tiredly. That's it. Stay mad at the world. Ranger lowered his head beside the puppy carefully. The storm outside weakened as pale morning light slowly spilled across the frozen ridge. The puppy opened his eyes for only a second, but instead of looking at Ethan, he stared toward the eastern forest beyond the window. Fear flooded the tiny animal instantly. His small body trembled again. Ranger stood at once, ears forward, body rigid. Both dogs focused on the trees, on something out there, something Ethan still couldn't see. And deep beneath the quiet beauty of Brightwater Ridge, beneath the snow and frozen earth and sleeping pines, something unseen continued breathing in the dark. By the time Ethan Calder reached the lower road, morning had already turned the snow to silver. Brightwater Ridge looked almost innocent beneath the pale winter sun. The pines glittered. The lake below the valley held a sheet of frozen light. Smoke lifted from distant chimneys in thin blue threads, and somewhere far off, a snowplow growled along the town road like an old bear forced out of bed too early. Ethan did not notice much of it. His attention stayed on the small bundle of blankets resting on the passenger seat. Milo was still alive, barely. The puppy's tiny body lay tucked inside 2 wool blankets and 1 old thermal liner Ethan had used during winter operations years ago. Only the tip of his cream-gray muzzle showed. Every few minutes, Ethan glanced over to make sure the puppy's chest still rose. Ranger sat in the back seat but leaned forward between the seats, his black harness creaking softly each time the truck hit a patch of ice. The 6-year-old German Shepherd had not slept either. His amber eyes looked tired, but not dull. They remained fixed on Milo with a quiet insistence, as if the puppy's life had become a post he had been ordered to guard. "Still with us," Ethan murmured. He was not sure whether he was speaking to Milo, to Ranger, or to himself. The drive into town took longer than usual. A fallen birch had blocked part of the road during the night, and Ethan had to ease the truck around it with 1 tire brushing the snowbank. His hands moved steadily on the wheel, but his mind kept returning to the puppy's eyes at dawn. That fear, not confusion, not weakness, recognition. Milo had looked toward the eastern forest as if something there had a name. Ethan had known men who woke from nightmares like that, men who did not remember where they were, only what had followed them. He had been one of them more than once. He understood the difference between fear of pain and fear of something remembered. The town of Brightwater appeared below the ridge in a shallow basin of snow-covered roofs and warm window light. It was small enough that everyone knew who had replaced a fence, who had baked too much bread, and who had not been seen at church in 3 Sundays. A bright red diner sat near the center road. A hardware store wore icicles like crooked teeth. The veterinary clinic stood at the far end, a low blue-gray building with a hand-painted sign shaped like a paw print. Ethan pulled in behind the clinic and killed the engine. Ranger was already standing before Ethan opened the door. "Easy," Ethan said. Ranger waited, but only because Ethan's voice asked him to. The back door of the clinic opened before Ethan reached it. Dr. Clara Whitmore stood in the doorway wearing a faded blue-gray veterinary coat over a cream sweater, dark jeans tucked into brown anti-slip boots dusted with road salt. She was 41, tall and practical, with pale skin sharpened by northern winters and long hours indoors under clinic lights. Her dark brown hair was tied low at the nape of her neck, though several loose strands had escaped around her temples. Her gray-brown eyes were alert, kind, and unsentimental, the eyes of a woman who had held too many living things at the edge of death to waste time pretending the edge was not there. "You made it," she said. "Barely." Clara stepped aside. "Bring him in." The clinic smelled of antiseptic, clean towels, animal fur, and burnt coffee. Somewhere beyond the front room, a cat protested from a carrier with the wounded dignity of a dethroned emperor. Milo did not react to the sound. That worried Ethan. Clara guided him into the treatment room, where a warming pad had already been prepared on the steel table. Ethan unwrapped Milo slowly, afraid the air itself might hurt him. Clara's expression tightened. "He's colder than I hoped. I did what you said." "I know." Her voice softened without becoming gentle enough to lie. "That may be why he's still here." She worked quickly. Temperature, gums, heart rate, pupils, hydration. Her hands were efficient, but not rough. Milo trembled once when she touched his chest, then sagged back into the towel. Ranger stood beside the table, nose lifted just high enough to see. Clara glanced at him. He can stay if he behaves. Ranger did not blink. Ethan almost smiled. He heard that as an insult. Good. Then he understood me. She slipped a small catheter into Milo's front leg and started warm fluids. The puppy gave a faint twitch, not even strong enough to resist. Ethan felt his jaw tighten. He had carried wounded men who weighed 200 pounds and cursed him the whole way to evacuation. He would have given anything for Milo to curse him now in whatever language puppies used. A yelp, a bite, a ridiculous little growl. Anything. Clara adjusted the flow. German Shepherd mix. 8 weeks, maybe 10. Severely hypothermic. Dehydrated. Underfed. No obvious fractures. Ethan looked at the puppy's neck. There's a mark. I saw. Clara parted the fur carefully. Around Milo's small neck was a faint pressure line, almost hidden beneath damp, cream-gray hair. It was not raw, not fresh, but too even to be natural. That wasn't from a normal collar, Ethan said. No, Clara replied. It wasn't. She took a microchip scanner from a drawer and passed it over Milo's shoulders. The device gave no sound. She tried again along the neck. Nothing. No chip? Ethan asked. Not public registry. Clara's voice had changed slightly. She turned away and opened a locked cabinet beneath the counter. From inside, she removed an older scanner, bulkier and scratched, with a cracked label on the side. Ethan noticed her thumb pause before she switched it on. That one special? He asked. Old rescue equipment. Read some non-standard tags. Non-standard. It's a polite word. I'm trying to behave before coffee. She passed the scanner slowly beneath Milo's left ear. The device chirped. Once. Sharp and small. Clara went very still. A code appeared on the tiny screen. J-09/field response litter. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Even Ranger seemed to stop breathing. Ethan looked from the screen to Clara's face. You know what that means. Clara did not answer immediately. She set the scanner down as if it had become heavier than metal. I know what part of it means. Clara. She looked at him then, and whatever she saw in his face made her stop measuring her words. Field response was terminology used by Haven 9. The name moved through Ethan like a cold blade sliding between ribs. Haven 9. He had not heard it spoken aloud in years, not since a winter operation filed away under clean titles and vague signatures. Environmental survival modeling, rescue route evaluation, cold weather hazard response. He remembered a command trailer, maps, screens, men and women in technical jackets speaking in acronyms. He remembered giving advice on terrain, timing, exposure, human decision-making under stress. He did not remember puppies. His voice came out lower. Haven 9 was shut down. It was supposed to be. When? 5 years ago, after a technical failure, according to the official version. Clara's mouth tightened. Unofficially, people heard things. What things? Missing animals, unmarked trucks, dogs that came back wrong, if they came back at all. The usual stories people tell when they know something is rotten, but don't have enough proof to survive saying it clearly. Ethan looked down at Milo. The puppy's eyelids fluttered. Field response litter. A litter. Not one puppy. His stomach sank. There are more. he said. Clara did not contradict him. She bent closer to Milo, examining the fur around his paws. Where exactly did Ranger find him? Eastern Trail, near an old vent shaft. A vent shaft? Warm air coming through, weak, but enough to keep him alive longer than he should have lasted outside. Clara looked up sharply. That area connects to North Hollow. Ethan knew the place. Dense timber. Old restricted land. The kind of quiet pocket of forest where snow swallowed sound before it reached your ears. Clara took a small brush and cleaned beneath Milo's claws. Gray-green dirt came loose in tiny flecks against the white pad. There, she said. What? Clay. North Hollow has this color. Most of the valley doesn't. She leaned close to Milo's coat and gently lifted the fur along his side. And this? Ethan waited. Her expression shifted again, more sorrow than fear this time. There's a faint scent of milk on him, not formula, mother's milk. Ranger made a low sound from his chest, not a growl, something sadder. Ethan felt it land in the room. Milo had a mother. Milo had not wandered from a backyard or slipped from a tourist's car. He had come from somewhere, from someone, maybe from something still alive in the snow. Milo stirred suddenly beneath Clara's hands. His tiny paws flexed. Then, with more strength than he had shown all morning, the puppy turned his head toward Ranger. Ranger stepped closer at once. Milo lifted one trembling paw and placed it against the side of Ranger's muzzle. The gesture was so weak it should not have meant anything. But Ranger froze. His ears angled forward, his eyes locked on the puppy's face, and for one strange moment Ethan had the impossible feeling that something wordless had passed between them. Not a command. Not recognition exactly. A plea. Clara whispered, I've seen frightened puppies reach for warmth. I've seen them search for their mothers. She swallowed. I've never seen one do that. Ranger lowered his head until his nose touched Milo's forehead. The puppy's body eased slightly, as if some part of him had finally delivered the message he had nearly died carrying. Ethan looked at Clara. Neither of them said what they were thinking, because saying it would make it real. And real meant there was another dog out there in the cold, maybe more than one. Clara broke the silence first. He needs a few hours here. I'm going back. I know. I need supplies. I know that too. She moved to a cabinet and began pulling items with brisk precision. Thermal wraps, soft restraints, wound wash, emergency glucose, a compact heat-reflective sling, small syringes, gauze, a bottle of warmed electrolyte solution. If the mother is injured, don't corner her, Clara said. If she's been protecting pups, she'll bite before she thinks. Let Ranger mediate if she tolerates him. Ethan packed each item into his field bag. You sound like you believe she's alive. I believe Milo didn't crawl out of North Hollow by accident. That was not an answer. It was worse. It was hope with teeth. A bell chimed from the front of the clinic. Clara glanced toward the hall, annoyed at first, then cautious. Through the small interior window, Ethan saw a dark SUV parked across the street, not in front of any business, not angled like someone running errands. Its windows were tinted. Clean tires. No roof snow. Not local. A man sat behind the wheel, face mostly hidden by windshield glare. Ranger saw it too. His body shifted subtly, moving between Milo's table and the door. Friend of yours? Ethan asked. Clara's face hardened. No. You recognize the vehicle? I recognize the type. She walked to the front window but did not step fully into view. A private environmental firm took over legal management of the old Haven 9 land after it was abandoned. They send vehicles through sometimes. Survey crews, they claim. Name? Northline Environmental Holdings. And the person behind it? Clara looked back at him. Dr. Warren Holt. Ethan knew the name faintly, not personally, from old documents, from briefings where scientific leads were mentioned like distant weather systems. Clara continued, her voice low. Holt ran Haven 9 in its final phase. Clean suit, clean language, clean hands whenever anyone asked questions. He was brilliant. He was also the kind of man who could watch a suffering animal and call it an adjustment variable. Ethan's eyes went back to Milo. The puppy breathed softly under the warming blanket. Small, fragile, evidence with a heartbeat. What would Holt want with him? Ethan asked. Clara's gaze did not move from the SUV. If that code is real, if Milo came from a litter connected to Haven 9? She paused. He would want him gone from public view. The words settled in Ethan's chest like iron. Outside, the SUV remained where it was. Watching. Clara returned to the treatment table and checked Milo's fluids again. Listen to me. Milo cannot leave yet. Not safely. Give me 3 hours. I don't know if whatever is out there has 3 hours. I know. Clara's voice softened. But if you rush in unprepared, you may lose the mother, the pups, and yourself. Ranger stood very still. Ethan placed one hand on the dog's harness. The red trim was faded at the edges from years of weather and hard use. Ranger did not look away from the door. For a moment, Ethan wished the world were simpler. A trail, a target, a rescue, a return. But the older he got, the more life refused to arrive in clean mission shapes. It came instead like winter fog, hiding edges, softening danger until a man stepped too far and found empty air beneath his boot. He looked down at Milo one more time. The puppy had fallen into a shallow sleep, but his small paw still rested near the place where Ranger's muzzle had been, as if holding on. Ethan zipped the field bag closed. I'll wait until he stabilizes, he said. Clara nodded, though relief did not fully reach her face. Outside, the SUV engine started. Slowly, without hurry, it pulled away from the curb and drove toward the eastern road. Ranger followed its movement with his eyes until it disappeared. Ethan watched the same direction. The road bent toward the forest, toward North Hollow, toward Haven 9. And somewhere beyond those bright, snow-covered trees, a mother dog might still be standing between her remaining pups and the thing that had driven Milo into the cold. Ethan Calder waited 3 hours. He hated every minute of it. Waiting was easy for some people. They dressed it up as patience, wisdom, restraint. Ethan had met officers who spoke of waiting as if it were a clean virtue, polished and framed on a wall. But men who had lived through extraction windows and failing radio calls knew another version of it. Waiting was a blade held against the ribs. Waiting was hearing someone breathe badly and knowing you could not move yet. So he waited by force, not because he wanted to, because Clara was right. Milo lay under the warming blanket inside the treatment room, a tiny shape beneath soft fabric and careful machines. The fluids had given some color back to his gums. His breathing was still shallow, but no longer fading like smoke in wind. Every so often, his small paws twitched, as if he were running through some dream too large for his body. Ranger stayed near the table until Clara finally looked at Ethan and said, "He can hold for now." The German Shepherd rose before Ethan did. Clara packed the last of the supplies into Ethan's field bag. Thermal wraps, gauze, wound wash, a compact heat-reflective sling, glucose gel, 2 soft muzzles, and a small rescue blanket folded so tight it looked harmless. Her movements were brisk, but Ethan noticed the way her eyes kept returning to Milo. She cared more than she allowed herself to show. That was why animals trusted her. People, Ethan had found, often trusted too loudly. Dogs trusted in silence. Clara zipped the bag. If the mother is alive, she'll be scared. Hurt mothers don't act like pets. They act like soldiers. Ethan slung the bag across his shoulder. I've worked with soldiers. Not ones with pups under them. That landed differently. He looked at Milo one last time. The puppy slept with his nose tucked into the blanket, impossibly small against the white medical pad. For a moment, Ethan had the foolish urge to apologize to him. Not for what he had done exactly, for what humans had done. For the terrible old habit of touching living things and calling the damage research, progress, necessity. Ranger nudged Ethan's hand. Time. Ethan nodded. Yeah, I know. Outside, the air was bright enough to hurt. The black SUV was gone, but its absence did not comfort him. Tracks remained where it had sat across from the clinic, the tires too clean-edged for a local truck. Ethan memorized the tread without meaning to. Old training did that. It stored details before conscience asked permission. He and Ranger left town without stopping. The road lifted from Brightwater's small basin into white hills and dark timber. The sun rode high now, turning every snowbank into glass. On a postcard, the place would have looked peaceful. Ethan knew better. Beauty did not make a thing safe. Sometimes beauty was only the mask danger wore when it wanted you to come closer. At the eastern trailhead, Ethan parked behind a stand of birch. Ranger jumped down before the truck door fully opened. His black harness with deep red trim stood out against the snow like a warning mark. Slow, Ethan said. Ranger glanced back once, not agreement, acknowledgement. They retraced the morning's path through the pines. Ethan avoided stepping on the small tracks where Milo had crawled. The snow had softened in the sunlight, but the broken pattern remained. Tiny paw prints, drag marks, places where the puppy had fallen and forced itself up again. Ethan had seen courage in many forms. He had not expected it to be this small. Ranger lowered his nose near the old vent shaft where warm air still rose faintly through the crusted snow. Ethan crouched beside it. Rusted metal slats formed a narrow opening, half buried under ice. Heat pulsed weakly from below, not steady, not natural. The puppy had come through there, or been pushed near it. Ethan studied the surrounding snow. Milo's tracks were not the only ones. There were larger paw prints, German Shepherd, adult. They moved in circles around the vent area, then doubled back toward the deeper forest. The pattern was wrong for wandering, too deliberate, too desperate. She tried to hide the trail, Ethan murmured. Ranger moved ahead. The dog did not run. He tracked with grim concentration, cutting through brush and around low branches heavy with snow. Ethan followed, reading what he could. Here, a scuff where an adult dog had slipped, and there a faint splash of frozen blood. Farther on, gray-brown hair caught on a splintered branch. Not old. Ethan's hand tightened around the strap of his bag. The forest changed as they entered North Hollow. The trees grew closer, their branches knitting overhead until the sunlight came down in narrow, pale columns. The snow no longer looked clean. In places, it had a glassy crust that cracked too loudly under Ethan's boots. In other places, it collapsed softly, hollow beneath. He stopped and drove the end of his walking pole into a patch ahead. It sank deeper than it should have. "Bad layering," he whispered. Ranger halted without being told. Ethan tested another patch. Solid top. Empty beneath. Like the snow had thawed and refrozen from below in uneven breaths. He looked toward the slope. North Hollow had always held cold longer than the rest of the ridge, and it should not have been warmer underneath. A faint metallic smell rode the air. Old machinery. Or memory. Ranger's ears angled forward, then flattened slightly. Beyond the trees, a weathered fence emerged from the snow. Haven 9. Not the official facility Ethan remembered from briefings. Not the clean diagrams or satellite overlays. The real place looked smaller, poorer, more forgotten. A low cluster of maintenance buildings sat half swallowed by drifts. One antenna leaned at an exhausted angle. A sign near the entrance had faded almost blank, though Ethan could still make out the ghost of black lettering beneath ice. Environmental Response Station, authorized access only. The words felt like a joke told at a funeral. Ranger approached the boundary and stopped. Ethan scanned the clearing. No fresh vehicle tracks, no visible movement, no human voices. But the place did not feel empty. Empty places relaxed. This one held its breath. They moved through the broken fence toward a side building with a caved-in awning. Ranger's nose went low. He crossed the threshold into a storage shed and immediately veered toward the back corner. Inside, the shed smelled of damp wood, old insulation, and animal fear. Ethan found the nest beneath a collapsed workbench. A bed made from torn fabric, dried pine needles, shredded thermal lining, and pieces of old tarp. There were small depressions where pups had curled together. Claw marks scratched the dust near the wall. He knelt. 3 pups, at least. Milo had been one. 2 remained unaccounted for, or worse. Ranger suddenly pawed at the floor near a warped metal panel leaning against the wall. Tap. Scrape. Tap. Ethan moved fast, and he dragged the panel aside, revealing a narrow maintenance cavity beneath the shed, half filled with drifted snow and old leaves. A sound came from inside, faint, living. Ethan dropped to his stomach and reached in with his flashlight. 2 tiny faces reflected back at him. Puppies. Both German Shepherd mixes, smaller than Milo, pressed against each other in the shallow cavity. One had darker gray fur along its spine, and a cream muzzle dusted white with frost. The other was paler, with one ear folded awkwardly over its head. Their eyes were open but unfocused, their bodies trembling in weak bursts. "Got you," Ethan whispered. The darker pup tried to retreat, but had no strength. Ranger lay flat beside Ethan, lowering his head until the pups could see him. He made a soft rumbling sound, not a growl, not a whine. Something deep and steady. The paler pup blinked, then slowly, it stopped shaking quite so hard. Ethan reached in with both hands and eased them out one at a time. They were cold, but not as far gone as Milo had been. The cavity, like the vent, held traces of warmth from somewhere below, enough to delay death, not enough to protect them. He wrapped both pups in thermal cloth and secured them in the heat sling against his chest. Their fragile bodies shifted weakly with each breath. Ranger was already facing the open door. Ethan followed his gaze. Blood drops marked the snow outside, leading deeper into the facility. The mother was close. Before Ethan stepped out of the shed, the darker puppy inside his sling began to move. Not much, just enough to push its tiny nose free of the thermal cloth. It turned its head toward the far side of the abandoned yard and released a sound so thin, Ethan almost missed it. A small cry, and the kind of cry no predator would fear. The kind only a mother would hear. From somewhere beyond the maintenance buildings hidden behind the wind, an answer came, low, broken. A single hoarse bark. Ranger went rigid. Ethan froze with one hand on the doorway. That bark was not warning. It was pain refusing to die. And for one strange, breathless second, Brightwater Ridge seemed to hold still around them. The snow, the trees, the old buildings, even the distant glittering sky, as if the forest itself had been waiting for that mother to answer. Ethan tightened the sling around the pups. "We hear you," he said softly. Then he followed the blood. The trail led past the storage shed, between two low concrete structures, and toward the central maintenance hatch half buried beneath wind-packed snow. Ethan moved slowly now, not because he doubted the path, but because Clara's warning pressed behind his eyes. Hurt mothers act like soldiers. He had 2 of her pups against his chest. Milo was alive in town. If she was still standing, she had survived cold, injury, and whatever had driven her from the facility. That deserved respect. Ranger stayed slightly ahead, but did not charge. His posture changed near the hatch. Lower, softer. He was not approaching an enemy. He was approaching grief with teeth. Ethan saw her beneath the shadow of the old hatch frame. The mother dog stood with her body angled sideways, one front leg stiff, shoulder darkened by frozen blood. She was a German shepherd, 4 or 5 years old, with a gray-brown and cream coat matted by snow and dirt. Her ribs showed beneath the fur, but strength still lived in the shape of her. Her ears were uneven from exhaustion, one raised, the other tilted back. Her amber eyes burned from a face made thin by hunger, fear, and motherhood. She bared her teeth. Ethan stopped immediately. "Easy," he said. Her lips lifted higher. Ranger stepped between them. The mother's eyes snapped to him. Her stance shifted, not relaxing, but recalculating. She smelled blood, cold, male dog, human, pups. Ethan lowered himself to one knee. Slowly, he unclipped the sling and placed the 2 wrapped puppies on the snow in front of him, far enough away that the mother could reach them without coming near his hands. The sound she made broke something in him. Not a bark, not a growl. A cracked, desperate whine dragged from the deepest part of her body. She stumbled forward, one step, then another. Her injured shoulder nearly buckled, but she reached the pups and began nosing them with frantic tenderness. She licked the darker one's face, then the pale one, then pressed her muzzle against their bodies as if counting them by breath. Ranger did not move. Ethan stayed kneeling, hands visible. "There's another," he said softly, though she could not understand the words. "Milo. He's alive." The mother dog lifted her head. For a moment, her amber eyes locked with Ethan's. There was no trust there, but there was something else. A question, or maybe accusation. Where? Ethan felt the weight of that imagined word settle in him. "In town," he whispered. "Safe." The dog swayed where she stood. Ranger moved closer by one step. She did not bite him. Ethan took that as permission for nothing more than the next breath. He pulled the rescue blanket from his bag and eased it across the snow toward her. The mother flinched when it touched her paw. Her teeth showed again, but exhaustion dragged her down faster than anger could hold her up. Ethan waited. Patience this time was not a blade. It was an offering. Minutes passed. Finally, Ranger lowered himself beside the two pups, leaving space for the mother. He placed his large body between Ethan and the little family, as if declaring a truce neither species had spoken aloud. The mother watched him. Then, slowly, painfully, she folded down beside her pups. Ethan released the breath he had been holding. "Nova," he said quietly. The name came without much thought, maybe because she looked like something bright that had burned almost to death and still refused to disappear. Nova's eyes half closed. Then the ground beneath the hatch gave a low, distant tremor, not enough to shake snow from the roof, enough for all three dogs to react. Ranger stood. Nova forced her head up, terror cutting through her exhaustion so sharply that her body tried to rise before it had strength. The two pups whimpered. Ethan turned toward the hatch. The metal door was partly exposed beneath the snow. On its surface, scraped and weathered but still visible, was the old Haven 9 symbol. A circle intersected by 3 thin lines. He remembered it from a file folder 5 years ago. A briefing room. A winter mission. A project he had been told was harmless. Ethan stared at the mark, and the past opened like a buried door. Behind him, Nova pressed her muzzle over her pups. Ranger stood beside Ethan, silent and rigid. From somewhere below them came a deep mechanical pulse. Not loud, not dead. Ethan looked down at the injured mother, then at the hatch, then toward the trail back to town. One thing at a time. That was how men survived impossible days. First, get them out. So Ethan wrapped Nova as best he could, secured the pups, and began the slow journey back through the bright winter forest, carrying with him not only 3 fragile lives, but the first undeniable proof that Haven 9 had never truly gone silent. By the time Ethan Calder reached the clinic again, the bright morning had become a hard, white afternoon. Snowlight pressed against every window of Brightwater like the world outside had been made of glass. The town looked peaceful from a distance, chimneys breathing smoke, parked trucks wearing caps of snow, shop windows glowing amber against the cold. But Ethan had carried enough wounded bodies to know peace could be only a surface. Under it, a thing could still be bleeding. Nova lay across the back seat of the truck, wrapped in the rescue blanket, her injured shoulder dark beneath the bandage Ethan had managed to press against the wound. The 2 puppies were secured in the heat sling against his chest. Ranger sat beside Nova, perfectly still except for the slow movement of his nose as he monitored her breathing. Nova did not sleep, as she watched Ethan through half-lidded amber eyes, not trusting him, not fully fighting him either. That uncertain middle ground felt heavier than hatred. Hatred was clean. Suspicion asked a man to keep proving himself with every breath. When Ethan pulled behind the clinic, Dr. Clara Whitmore was already waiting at the back door. Her face changed when she saw Nova. Not shock. Clara had trained herself out of shock years ago, but sorrow moved through her eyes, quick and sharp, before discipline covered it. "Oh, girl," she said softly. Nova lifted her head and growled. Ranger stepped forward, not threatening, not submissive, simply present. Nova's growl faded into a broken rumble. Clara noticed. "He's the only reason she's not trying to remove your hand." "Probably mine too," Ethan said. Inside, Milo woke at the scent of his mother. The tiny puppy tried to rise from his warming pad and nearly collapsed. Clara caught him before Ethan could move. Milo released a small, desperate cry. Nova answered from the treatment table. The sound she made was not loud, but it changed the room. It pulled every living thing toward it. Milo squirmed weakly. The two rescued puppies shifted inside the sling. Nova forced herself up despite the pain in her shoulder, front legs trembling under the effort. Clara's voice softened. "Easy. We'll bring them to you." Ethan placed the two puppies beside Nova first. She nosed them with frantic care, counting them by touch, by smell, by breath. Then Clara gently lifted Milo and set him within reach. For one breath, Nova froze. Then she bent over him. Her body shook so hard Ethan thought she might fall. She licked Milo's face, his ears, his tiny paws, almost urgently, as if trying to erase the cold from his memory. Milo pressed his nose into her neck and went still. Not limp. Safe. Ethan looked away. He had seen reunions before. Men returning from operations. Children running to fathers. Wives holding faces with both hands as though making sure the dead had not come home wearing familiar skin. But this was quieter, and somehow it hurt more. Clara cleared her throat. "Help me stabilize her." They worked for nearly an hour. Nova had a deep shoulder laceration, bruising along her ribs, dehydration, and signs of prolonged stress. She was underweight, but not starved. Strong, naturally. Built like a working-line shepherd, lean and purposeful, with gray-brown and cream fur roughened by cold and fear. Her eyes remained watchful even when exhaustion dragged her head down. Every time Ethan moved too close to the puppies, Nova's gaze sharpened. Clara scanned her carefully once the bleeding was controlled. The first scanner showed nothing. The second one, the old scratched reader Clara had used on Milo, chirped beneath Nova's left shoulder. A code appeared. N-01/adaptive maternal response. Clara stared at the screen. Ethan felt the room grow colder. "Maternal," he said. Clara's jaw tightened. They categorized her by what she would do for her pups. Ranger stood near the table, ears forward. Ethan looked at Nova, at the way her injured body still curved protectively around her litter. Something in him went very still. There were cruelties that came from rage. And there were cruelties that came from distance. Rage at least admitted something living stood before it. Distance turned a mother into a label. Adaptive maternal response. A neat name for a wound. Clara set the scanner down. "There's someone you need to talk to." "Who?" "Miles Calder." Ethan had heard the name once or twice around town. A repairman. Radios, generators, snowplow hydraulics, anything with wires and old bolts. People called him when machines failed and when apologies were overdue, though Ethan had never understood the second part. Clara removed her gloves. "He worked maintenance at Haven 9. Ethan's eyes lifted. "You didn't mention that before. I wasn't sure he would talk. And now?" Clara looked at Nova and the puppies. Now he should. Miles Calder's workshop sat behind a row of old spruce trees on the edge of town, half garage, half graveyard for machines that refused to die. Snowdrifts leaned against the walls. A faded sign over the door read, "Calder Repair," in blue letters peeling from the wood. Ethan went alone at first. Ranger stayed at the clinic with Nova and the pups because Nova grew calmer when he was nearby. Ethan did not like leaving him, but Clara was right again. Ranger was doing more good there than he could in a workshop full of rusted engines. Miles opened the door after the third knock. He was 52, thin in a way that looked carved down rather than naturally lean, with wide shoulders that had once been stronger. His brown-gray hair stuck out unevenly from beneath a wool cap. A few days' worth of stubble shadowed his jaw, Not enough to be a beard. Enough to suggest shaving had become one more thing he postponed. His pale blue eyes were tired and careful. The skin around them had the worn look of a man who slept but did not rest. His hands were broad, cracked, and darkened by old grease. When he saw Ethan, his expression closed. Truck trouble? Haven 9 trouble. Miles did not move. The silence between them was answer enough. Ethan took the old scanner code Clara had written on paper and held it out. Miles looked at it. Something in his face fell inward. Where did you get that? From a mother dog we found half dead at North Hollow. 3 pups. One almost froze to death. Miles swallowed. The workshop hummed softly behind him, an old heater, a hanging light, the patient ticking of cooling metal. I don't know anything, Miles said. Ethan studied him. Lying usually had motion in it. Too much eye contact. Too little. Hands busy. Shoulders angled toward escape. Miles did none of that. He simply looked like a man watching a bill come due after 5 long years. Yes, you do, Ethan said. Miles closed his eyes. For a moment, he looked older than 52. Then he stepped back. Come in. Inside the workshop, Miles walked to a locked cabinet beneath a shelf of broken radio parts. His hands shook as he opened it. From inside, he took out a small metal keyring with 3 old keys and a plastic tag faded almost white. Ethan expected a number, a room code, a storage label. Instead, written in black marker, barely visible, was a name. Nova Miles stared at the tag as if it had become a ghost in his hand. I kept telling myself they transferred her, he whispered. That's what Holt said. All live subjects relocated. All files sealed. His voice cracked on the next words. But she had a name before she had a code. Ethan looked at the keyring, then at Miles. In that small, oil-smelling room, with snow tapping the window like fingers from another world, the story shifted. This was no longer only about a system that had failed. It was about people who had known enough to look away. Miles sat at an old workbench and told him what he could. Haven 9 had begun clean, or close enough that men like Miles could believe in it. Weather modeling, winter survival forecasting, animal movement tracking to predict avalanches and dangerous ice shifts. The valley had lost hikers before. Children. Hunters. One search team member. People wanted better warning systems. Then Dr. Warren Holt arrived. Miles described him as brilliant and bloodless. A man in his late 50s with silver-gray hair combed perfectly back, pale skin untouched by outdoor labor, and eyes so light blue they seemed almost colorless. He spoke softly, never rushed, never raised his voice. That was what made him frightening. He could make cruelty sound like procedure. Holt said observation wasn't enough, Miles said. He said a system couldn't predict survival unless it learned how living things respond under pressure. What kind of pressure? Miles rubbed both hands over his face. Small changes at first. Low-frequency sound. Ground vibration. Heat vents. Directional airflow. Pressure shifts. Nothing that looked dramatic on paper. Enough to scare animals. Enough to make them adapt. Ethan heard the old briefing room again. Maps. Cold weather routes. Technical voices. His own younger certainty. I was there, Ethan said quietly. 72 hours. Terrain consultant. Miles nodded slowly. I remember. You weren't cleared for the animal sectors. Ethan's eyes narrowed. But my route models were used. Yes. The word was soft. Damning anyway. Miles stood and pulled a rolled map from a drawer. It showed Haven 9's underground layout, far larger than the surface buildings suggested. Maintenance tunnels, vent shafts, sensor nodes. A central access chamber Ethan had never been shown. "The core didn't shut down?" Ethan asked. Miles gave a humorless laugh. "Not fully. Holt built it with backup layers. Geothermal trickle from the ridge fault. Solar storage from the sensor poles. Low-power hibernation mode. It was supposed to preserve data during storms. 5 years? If it kept cycling at low demand, yes." Ethan looked at the map. "And in winter?" "It wakes more often. More environmental stress. More input." The answer settled like ice water in Ethan's veins. Miles opened an old laptop, its casing cracked near the hinge. He connected a storage drive from the cabinet and loaded a folder labeled Archive Partial. The first video stuttered before resolving. A control room. Screens. Technicians. Ethan saw himself. Younger by 5 years, cleaner around the eyes, standing near a terrain map with arms crossed. He wore the face of a man who thought usefulness and righteousness were close relatives. A voice came through the speaker, distorted but recognizable. His own. "Run the cycle again." Ethan did not move. On screen, a technician adjusted environmental parameters. Another spoke about response latency. Animal movement patterns appeared as points of light over the terrain map. Ethan watched dots change direction before hazard markers appeared. "What am I looking at?" he asked, though part of him already knew. Miles answered quietly. The moment it stopped just observing. The footage jumped. A woman's voice said, "The maternal subject is anticipating pressure before release." Another voice, Holt's, calm and almost pleased. "Then increase the interval unpredictability." Ethan's throat tightened. On the monitor, one marker split from 2 smaller ones, circling back again and again. Through a stress corridor. Nova, before she had been Nova to him, when she had been a code to them. The video distorted, voices overlapped. "It's generating conditions outside scheduled parameters. Manual hold isn't responding. Pressure nodes are still active." Then Ethan's voice again, sharper this time from the recording. "Pull personnel from the lower field." He remembered that, not clearly, not fully. A warning tone. A technician swearing. Someone saying it was contained. Ethan ordering people out because the terrain model no longer matched the ground under their boots, and he had believed the danger was structural. He had not known animals were still inside the model. Miles stopped the footage. The room felt too small. Ethan stood with his hands braced on the workbench. His reflection stared back at him from the laptop screen. Older now, harder, less certain. That was the mercy and curse of years. They took arrogance first, if a man let them. "I didn't know," Ethan said. Miles looked at him with exhausted honesty. "Neither did I. Not at first. But later?" Miles closed the laptop slowly. "Later, I suspected enough that I should have done more." Outside, wind pushed snow against the workshop door. Ethan thought of Nova curled around her pups in the clinic, coded by strangers according to the pain they could extract from her love. And he thought of Milo, small enough to fit inside 2 hands, crawling through snow, because somewhere beneath the earth men had once asked a machine to test survival. He looked at Miles. "Then do more now." Miles nodded once, not proudly, not dramatically, like a man accepting a sentence. "I still have the lower access map," he said. "And some old credentials. They may not work. They're a start." Miles picked up the key ring with Nova's faded tag and held it for a long moment before placing it in Ethan's palm. "She was never supposed to still be there," he said. Ethan closed his fingers around the keys. "No," he answered, "but she was." When Ethan returned to the clinic, the light had begun to fade. Ranger met him at the treatment room door. Nova lay with all 3 pups tucked against her belly. Milo was the smallest, still weak, but his nose pressed into his mother's fur with stubborn devotion. Clara stood nearby, arms folded, watching the little family with tired eyes. She looked at the key ring in Ethan's hand. "Is that what I think it is?" "Maybe." Nova lifted her head, her amber gaze fixed on the faded plastic tag dangling from Ethan's fingers. For the first time since he had found her, she did not growl. She stared. Then her ears lowered, and a faint shiver passed through her battered body. Recognition. Pain. Memory. Ethan knelt several feet away and placed the keys gently on the floor between them. "I don't know how much of this I helped build," he said quietly, "but I'm going back." Ranger stepped beside him. Nova lowered her head over her pups again, but her eyes remained open. Outside the clinic windows, Brightwater Ridge darkened beneath a soft violet dusk, and somewhere far east, under old concrete and sleeping snow, Haven 9 waited with its unfinished memories still running. Morning came too clean. That was the first thing Ethan Calder noticed when he stepped out of the clinic with Miles Ketter's old map folded inside his jacket. The sky above Brightwater Ridge was pale blue, polished by cold. Sunlight slid across the roofs and snowbanks with the brightness of a blessing. If a person looked only once, the whole valley seemed peaceful enough to forgive anything. Smoke lifted from chimneys. A child dragged a red sled across a yard. Somewhere near Main Street, a truck backfired, and a dog barked twice in offended reply. But Ethan had stopped trusting beautiful surfaces a long time ago. Inside the clinic, Nova lay with her pups tucked against her body. Milo remained the smallest and weakest, but he had begun to root blindly for warmth with stubborn life. Ranger had spent most of the night between Nova's table and the door, as if the clinic itself had become a perimeter. Now Ranger moved beside Ethan again, black harness dark against the snow, deep red trim catching the light. The German shepherd's amber eyes scanned the tree line beyond town. Miles waited near his old repair truck. The former Haven 9 engineer looked smaller in daylight than he had in the workshop. 52 years old, thin, with a brown-gray stubble shadowing his jaw and a wool cap pulled low over tired blue eyes. His canvas jacket was patched at one elbow, his gloves dark with grease. He carried a tool bag in one hand and gilt in the other, though only one of those made noise when he walked. "You sure you want to do this today?" Miles asked. Ethan looked east. "No." Miles blinked. Ethan opened the truck door. "And that wasn't the question." They drove toward North Hollow in silence. The first sensor pole stood half-buried near a narrow ridge, a skeletal metal thing capped with frost. Miles knelt beside it, opened the casing with a key from the old Haven 9 ring, and exposed a cluster of wires and a dim diagnostic screen. Ethan watched the forest instead. Ranger stood 10 yards ahead, facing downslope. Not tense, not relaxed, listening. Miles tapped the screen with a cracked fingernail. "This station says wind direction is southwest. Humidity stable. Ground temperature -9 Celsius. Ethan turned his face into the air. The wind struck his cheek from the north. Cold. Dry. Direct. "Sensor's wrong." Miles looked up. "No, that's worse." "Explain." "If it were broken, It would flatline or spike. Miles pointed to the screen. This is clean data. It's just reporting a version of the valley that isn't happening here. Ethan looked down at the snow beneath his boots. A version of the valley. The phrase stayed with him. They moved from station to station. The second sensor showed ground temperature warmer than air temperature by too much. The third logged no vibration, though Ranger stopped 20 feet away from it and refused to cross a patch of untouched snow until Ethan tested it with his pole. The crust cracked. Beneath was hollow space where snow should have been packed solid. Heat venting from below? Ethan asked. Miles rubbed his mouth. Or redirected airflow from old pressure ducts. There were maintenance lines all through this section. You said old. I also said Holt overbuilt everything. The name traveled between them like a bitter taste. Dr. Warren Holt had not appeared in person yet, but his shape existed everywhere. In the coded name beneath Nova's skin. In the old video. In Miles's shame. In the hollow snow that looked solid until a man put weight on it. The deeper they moved, the stranger the forest became. Birds flew, but not right. A small flock crossed above the pines, then split suddenly in opposite directions, each line veering as though avoiding an invisible wall. A raven landed on a dead branch, opened its beak, then launched away without a sound. Ranger followed the birds with his eyes. Then his ears flattened. Ethan stopped. What? The dog lowered his head toward an open depression between the trees. The clearing ahead looked ordinary. Smooth snow, pale sunlight. A few scattered branches. But Ethan felt it before he saw anything. Pressure. Not wind. Not cold. A subtle push against the inner ear, like the world had taken a deep breath and not released it. Miles whispered, "Don't go farther." Ethan did not need the warning. Ranger stepped in front of him anyway. The German shepherd planted himself across Ethan's path, broad chest squared, gaze fixed on the clearing. Not fear. Refusal. Ethan thought of 5 years ago. He thought of the younger man on the archive footage, standing before screens, saying, "Run the cycle again." That man would have stepped closer, measured it, tested it, forced certainty out of danger because uncertainty felt like weakness. The man standing in the snow now looked at Ranger's rigid body and stayed where he was. "All right," Ethan said softly. "We don't poke the sleeping god." Miles gave him a strange look. "What?" "Nothing," Miles said. "Just never heard someone threaten science like mythology before. It started it." For the first time all morning, Miles almost smiled. Ranger suddenly moved. Not forward. Sideways. He circled the edge of the clearing with slow, deliberate steps, nose low but not touching the snow. Ethan followed with his eyes, reading the path. The dog stopped near a fallen pine limb and began pawing carefully, not digging wildly, uncovering. Ethan crossed to him and brushed away the loose powder. Beneath the snow lay a small metal tag, cracked at one corner, attached to a torn strip of faded red fabric. Miles crouched beside him, his face drained. Ethan turned the tag over. A single marking remained beneath frost and scratches. N-01. Nova's code. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Ranger lowered his nose to the strip of fabric and let out a sound Ethan had never heard from him before. Not a growl, not a whine, a low, grieving breath. Miles stared at the tag. "She was here." Ethan's fingers closed around the frozen metal. Not years ago. Not only in the records. Nova had crossed this exact edge with something hunting her from beneath the earth, carrying her pups through a forest that no longer obeyed its own rules. Ethan looked back toward the clearing. The snow was unbroken, beautiful, waiting. And suddenly, the valley felt less like a place abandoned by science and more like an altar where too many living things had been asked to pay. They marked the location and continued. By afternoon, they had confirmed enough to make denial impossible. Haven 9's old network was not merely alive in some buried room. It was reaching outward through forgotten infrastructure, pressure vents, thermal lines, vibration nodes, and sensor poles disguised by frost and years of neglect. And it was not controlling nature like magic. That would have been easier to hate. It was nudging, testing, changing small conditions, watching response patterns, adjusting again. A god would have been more honest. A machine did not need malice to become cruel. Miles transmitted rough readings back to Clara through the clinic radio. Her voice came through thin and tense. "Nova's agitated," Clara said. "All 3 pups, too. Milo started crying when your last signal came in." Ethan looked at Ranger. The German shepherd had already turned toward town. "What else?" Ethan asked. A pause. Then Clara's voice dropped. "A man came by asking about the shepherd litter." Miles went still. Ethan's hand tightened on the radio. "Name?" "He said he represented Northline Environmental Holdings." "Describe him." "Late 50s. Tall, narrow build, silver gray hair, perfectly combed. Expensive charcoal coat. Very polite. Very dead behind the eyes." Miles closed his eyes briefly. "Holt," he said. Ethan pressed the radio closer. "Did he threaten you?" "Not directly. Men like that rarely dirty their own language. He said the animals were property connected to a closed research asset and should be transferred for appropriate containment." Ethan's voice went flat. "No." "I told him the same, with more syllables." Despite everything, Ethan almost smiled. Clara continued. "He left. But Ethan..." "What?" He looked at Milo like he recognized him. The winter air seemed to sharpen around Ethan. Ranger gave a low growl toward the distant road. They returned to town before dusk. The clinic appeared warm from the outside, its windows glowing amber against the blue snow. But Ranger was out of the truck before Ethan spoke, moving fast toward the rear entrance. Ethan followed. The back door stood open by 2 inches. Clara met him in the hall, face pale but controlled. A small smear of blood marked one knuckle. Not hers, judging from the calm fury in her eyes. "He came through the back," she said. "Not Holt. Someone younger. Tried to get into the records cabinet." "The dogs?" "Safe." Ranger pushed past them into the treatment room. Nova was on her feet despite Clara's bandage, body shaking, standing over the pups. Her lips were pulled back, but her eyes were wide with pain and terror. Milo pressed against her belly, trembling. Ethan scanned the room, cabinet open, papers scattered. The old scanner gone from the counter, but not taken, knocked to the floor. Near the back door, Ranger lowered his nose and sniffed. Then he pawed at something beneath the metal shelf. Ethan crouched. A small device lay there, matte black, about the size of a matchbox, with a cracked casing and a tiny speaker grill. Miles stepped into the room behind him and whispered a curse. "What is it?" Clara asked. Miles took it carefully between 2 fingers. "Directional tone emitter. Haven 9 used these in field trials." "To do what?" "Trigger orientation response, stress response, Recall patterns. Miles looked at Nova. Or panic. Clara's face hardened. He used that near my clinic? Someone did. Ethan looked at Ranger. The dog was staring not at the device, but at Nova. The mother shepherd would not stop shaking. Ethan knew then that Holt was not just covering old sins. He still had tools, access, men willing to use them, and he wanted the living evidence removed. They did not sleep that night. Clara moved Nova and the pups into an interior recovery room with no exterior windows. Miles stayed to repair the back lock and rig an alarm from spare clinic wire and a pressure bell. Ethan sat beside the door with Ranger at his feet, rifle across his knees, listening to every sound the building made. Before dawn, Miles unfolded the old map again on Clara's desk. "There's a core access point we haven't checked," he said. Ethan leaned over the paper. Miles tapped a section east of the maintenance yard, beyond the sensor fields, near a narrow ravine marked by an old drainage channel. "Main control?" "Not main. Deeper. If the surface stations are still receiving instructions, the core logic is coming from here." Clara stood behind them, arms folded, dark hair falling loose around her tired face. "Can you shut it down from there?" Miles hesitated. "No." Ethan looked up. Miles swallowed. "Not safely. Not without seeing what state it's in. But we might be able to reduce activity, isolate zones, stop the spread." Might. The word did not comfort anyone. By first light, Ethan and Ranger headed back toward North Hollow with Miles following in his repair truck. They did not go to the storage shed this time. Ranger led them beyond it, past the old maintenance hatch, through a stand of black spruce, where snow hung in heavy curtains from the branches. The ravine appeared gradually, a shallow cut through the earth, half hidden by drifted snow and blue shadow. At its far edge, ice had formed over a narrow drainage channel like frozen glass over a wound. Ranger stopped beside a buried shape near the rock wall. He pawed once. Miles brushed away snow with gloved hands until metal appeared. A hatch, round-edged, nearly invisible beneath frost and soil. On its surface was the Haven 9 symbol, clearer than the others, preserved under ice. Below it, stamped into the metal, were the words, "Core Control." Miles sat back on his heels. "Oh God," he whispered. Ethan stared at the hatch. Under his boots, something pulsed once through the ground. Soft. Patient. Waiting. Ranger stood beside him, silent and rigid. Far back in town, Nova and her pups were alive because they had escaped this place. Now Ethan had found the heart that had taught the forest to like. The hatch did not open easily. Miles Ketter had expected that. He knelt beside the frozen metal with his cracked gloves pressed against the rim, breath fogging over the Haven. 9 symbol stamped into the surface. His old key ring trembled slightly in his hand, not from the cold, Ethan thought, but from memory. Above them, Brightwater Ridge glittered under a hard morning sun. The ravine lay quiet beneath spruce shadows. Snow clung to the rock wall in blue, white folds. Everything looked too pure for what waited underneath. Miles slid one key into the recessed lock. It resisted. He swore softly, adjusted the angle, then tried again. The lock gave with a dull metallic click that seemed far too small for a door that had kept 5 years of secrets. Ranger stood beside Ethan, rigid and silent. The German shepherd's cream. Gray coat stirred faintly in the wind, his black harness dark against the snow. His amber eyes stayed fixed on the opening seam. Miles pulled the hatch upward. Cold air breathed out. Not forest cold, machine cold, dry, stale, processed. Ethan looked down into the narrow shaft. A ladder disappeared into shadow. lit only by a faint pulse of dim blue light somewhere below. For a moment, the opening looked less like an entrance, and more like the throat of some buried creature. Miles swallowed. Core access. Ethan checked the radio clipped to his vest. "Clara, we're going in." Static cracked. Then Dr. Clara Whitmore's voice came through, tight but steady. "I hear you. Nova's restless. The pups are stable. Milo's awake." That last word gave Ethan something to hold. Awake. Not safe, not healed, but awake. "Keep the line open," Ethan said. "I'm not going anywhere." Ethan looked at Ranger. "Stay close." The dog did not need to be told. Ethan descended first. The ladder was colder than the air, each rung biting through his gloves. His boots touched concrete 20 feet below. Miles followed more slowly, knees stiff, tool bag clinking against the ladder. Ranger came last with careful, practiced movements, placing each paw as if the metal itself might lie. The corridor below was narrow. The walls were poured concrete, damp in some places, dry and powdery in others. Old cables ran along the ceiling like black roots. A low hum threaded the air. Ethan felt it in his teeth. Miles led the way using a small flashlight, though dim emergency strips still glowed along the baseboards. "Backup power," he muttered. "Shouldn't be this clean." How clean? Clean enough to worry me. They reached a sealed door marked Core Control. Miles entered a code from memory. Nothing happened. He tried another. A red light flickered. Ethan said nothing. Waiting here was not like waiting at the clinic. This time, the blade pressed from inside the walls. Miles closed his eyes, breathed once, then entered a third sequence. The door unlocked. Beyond it, the heart of Haven. 9 still beat. Not dramatic. No shining laboratory. No villain's throne. No altar for the god science had pretended not to become. Just a low concrete chamber filled with dark screens, aging servers, bundled cables, and one central console glowing with a slow, patient pulse. Blue light washed across Ethan's face. The console displayed layered maps of Brightwater Ridge, wind vectors, ground temperature, pressure nodes, animal movement patterns represented by small points of light. Some points moved naturally, others bent around invisible lines. Miles stepped toward the console as if approaching a grave. "It kept building models," he whispered. Ethan stared at the screen. "Of the forest?" Miles shook his head. "Of everything touching the forest." A small icon flashed. Adaptive pressure parameters. Active Ranger growled low. Ethan looked at the options on the main display. Power down sequence, unstable system purge, unknown cascade risk manual override, partial access adaptive pressure parameters. Active. Miles rubbed a shaking hand over his mouth. "If we kill it outright, we don't know what releases." Releases? Thermal channels, pressure vents, behavior loops. Some of this has been compensating for its own damage for years. Miles stared at the map. "Pull the brace too fast, the broken roof falls." Ethan understood braces. He understood broken roofs. He understood bodies held together by temporary measures that no one dared remove. Clara's voice crackled over the radio. "What are you seeing?" Ethan answered without taking his eyes from the screen. A system that never stopped learning. Miles connected his old laptop to the console. "I may be able to get parameter access, May?" Miles gave a tired, humorless breath. "That's the most honest word I have left," Ethan almost replied. Ranger moved first. The dog turned toward the corridor behind them, ears sharp. Ethan lifted his rifle. Footsteps echoed in the passage, slow, unhurried. A man appeared in the doorway wearing a charcoal winter coat too clean for the ravine above. He was tall, narrow, framed, late 50s, with silver, gray hair combed back, so neatly it looked untouched by wind. His pale skin had the smooth, indoor quality of men who commanded fieldwork from warmed offices. Thin black gloves covered his hands. His eyes were a light, almost colorless blue, Dr. Warren Holt looked at the room, then at Ethan, then at Miles. His expression did not change. "Mr. Ketter," he said softly, "you always did keep things longer than you should." Miles went rigid. Ethan kept the rifle low but ready. "That's far enough." Holt glanced at him with polite interest. "Ethan Calder, I remember you. You were useful." The word struck harder than an insult. Useful, not brave, not skilled, not human. Useful Ranger stepped forward and bared his teeth. Holt's gaze shifted to the dog. "Remarkable animal. Don't talk about him." For the first time, Holt almost smiled. Behind him, 2 men entered. One was broad, mid-30s, with a shaved head, heavy jaw, and a black utility jacket stretched over thick shoulders. The other was younger, thin, nervous, eyed, with patchy stubble and a dark knit cap pulled low. Both carried the air of men paid to follow instructions without asking what kind of person that made them. Holt raised one hand slightly. "No need for drama." "You broke into the clinic," Ethan said. "I recovered proprietary assets. Those assets are living animals." Holt's face remained calm. Animals that were part of a controlled research system. Miles stepped forward, voice shaking. "It wasn't controlled." Holt looked at him almost sadly. "You never understood scale, Miles. You understood wiring. That is not the same thing." Miles flinched. And Ethan saw what years of that voice had done to him. Not shouting, not rage, just slow, clean belittlement, like acid poured one drop at a time. The console suddenly brightened. No one touched it. A live map expanded across the main screen, showing Brightwater Ridge in pale blue lines. Near town, 4 small heat signatures clustered inside the veterinary clinic. Nova, Milo, the 2 pups. Then another marker appeared beside them. Ranger's profile. The system had identified him. A new label flickered beneath his moving signal. 03 unregistered lineage match. Ethan felt Ranger go still beside him. Holt's calm finally cracked. Only slightly. His eyes sharpened with hunger. "Well," Holt whispered, "that explains why he found them." Ethan looked from the screen to Ranger. The dog did not look afraid. He looked back at Ethan steady and silent, as if the machine had spoken a name that never belonged to it. In that moment, Ethan understood something with painful clarity. Haven 9 had not merely harmed Nova's family. It had been watching for bloodlines, instincts, patterns of loyalty and survival that no decent man would ever try to own. Ethan stepped between Holt and Ranger. "You don't get him either." Holt's face smoothed again, but his voice cooled. "You have no idea what you're standing in front of." "I know exactly what I'm standing in front of." Ethan turned the rifle slightly toward Holt's men. "Back up." The broad man hesitated. The younger one looked at Holt. Holt's gloved hand moved toward a slim device in his coat pocket. Miles saw it first. "No." Holt pressed the control. The room shuddered. Lights flickered. A pressure wave rolled through the chamber, subtle but powerful enough to make Ethan's ears pop. Ranger barked once, sharp and furious. On the console, warnings spread across the map. Remote purge request detected core stability, compromised adaptive response. Escalating. Miles lunged for the console. "He's trying to wipe the logs." Holt stepped back. Data corruption can be unfortunate. Ethan moved. The broad man came at him from the left. Ethan did not fire. He drove the rifle stock into the man's wrist, stepped inside his reach, and put him hard against the concrete wall. The younger man froze when Ranger turned on him, teeth bared, body low and ready. "Don't," Ethan said. The younger man believed him. Miles worked at the console with frantic hands. "I can block purge, but parameters are spiking." "What happens if they spike?" "Pressure nodes widen. Thermal offsets increase. The system will defend its active model." English. "The forest gets worse." Ethan shoved the broad man down and moved beside Miles. "What do we do?" Miles pointed at the screen. "Not power down. Not purge. Parameter reduction here." Ethan stared at the options. Adaptive pressure rate. Response sensitivity. Active influence boundary. He had spent much of his life solving danger through force. Break the weapon, stop the threat, remove the source. Clean actions, at least in theory. But the screen offered no clean action. Only degrees of harm. Clara's voice burst through static. Ethan, what's happening? Nova just collapsed against the wall. The pups are crying. Ethan's chest tightened. Holt spoke from behind him, voice still maddeningly composed. If you interfere incorrectly, you may destabilize the whole ridge. Ethan did not turn. You lost the right to advise anyone. Miles opened partial access. First value. Lower it slowly. Ethan placed his hand on the console. The interface recognized old authorization fragments from his archived profile. That fact sickened him more than he expected. Some part of Haven. 9 still remembered him as useful. He reduced adaptive pressure rate by 10%. The system resisted. Warnings flashed. Miles said, again smaller. Ethan adjusted 5% more. The room's hum changed pitch. Ranger stayed between Ethan and Holt, holding the line like a mythic guardian at the mouth of the underworld. Response sensitivity came next. Ethan lowered it carefully. Too much, Miles warned, and the system might fail to compensate for changes already embedded in the terrain. Too little, and it would keep overreacting. Ethan thought of Milo's tiny body under blankets. Nova shaking over her pups. Ranger staring at him as though trust were not obedience, but a choice renewed every second. He adjusted the value, accepted. The final control was hardest. Active influence boundary. The system showed a wide pale radius extending beyond Haven. 9 beyond North Hollow, toward the lower road and the town. It expanded this far? Ethan asked. Miles nodded, pale. Not continuously, but enough. Ethan dragged the boundary inward. The console flashed red. Boundary contraction may cause localized instability, Holt spoke again. You see, it grew because it needed to. Ethan looked at the map, at the artificial veins reaching through the valley. No, he said. It grew because no one told it enough. He confirmed the contraction. For one long second, nothing happened. Then the hum dropped. Not vanished. Dropped. The pulse beneath the floor slowed. The map recalculated. Pressure nodes dimmed one by one, shrinking toward the core area. Clara's voice returned, clearer this time. Ethan, the dogs just quieted. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Not victory. Relief was too soft a word. It felt more like setting down a weapon he had been carrying for 5 years without knowing it. Miles copied the core logs onto a secure drive while Holt stood silent, watched by Ranger and Ethan's rifle. The 2 hired men did not move again. By the time state environmental officers and sheriff's deputies reached the hatch, called by Clara before Ethan had ever gone below. The morning sun had shifted westward. The officers cuffed Holt without ceremony. His face remained composed until one of them took the remote device from his pocket. Then, for the first time, anger showed. Not guilt. Possession. Ethan watched and understood the difference. Holt did not mourn what he had harmed. He mourned what he had lost control over. When Ethan finally climbed back to the surface, cold air struck his face cleanly. Ranger emerged beside him, then Miles, who looked hollowed out but upright. The forest sounded different. Not healed. Not safe. But less strained. Wind moved through the spruce from the direction it should have. Somewhere far above, a bird called once. Then another answered. Ethan's radio crackled. Clara's voice came through, thick with exhaustion and something brighter underneath. Milo just ate on his own. Ethan stood very still. After all the buried machines, all the old sins, all the choices that had no clean edge, that was the thing that nearly broke him. A puppy ate. A tiny life chose to stay. Ranger pressed his shoulder against Ethan's leg. Ethan looked out across Brightwater Ridge, toward the clinic, toward Nova, toward the fragile lives waiting there. "We're coming back," he said. And beneath the snow, Haven, 9 kept pulsing. Slower now bounded, no longer reaching for the whole valley. For now, that had to be enough. The first sign that Brightwater Ridge had changed was not dramatic. No thunder split the sky. No buried machine screamed itself silent beneath the mountain. No sudden spring burst through the snow like some merciful god had decided, at last, to forgive them. It was smaller than that. A bird called from the western tree line just after sunrise, then another answered. Ethan Calder stood outside the veterinary clinic with his hands in the pockets of his old combat pants, looking toward the ridge where the sound had come from. The air was still cold enough to sting his lungs, but it no longer felt pressed flat against his skin. For days, the forest had carried tension like a held breath. Now that breath had loosened. Not released. Loosened. That mattered. Inside the clinic, Milo had eaten on his own again, a teaspoon of softened food, barely enough to impress anyone who did not understand the scale of miracles. But Ethan understood. Dr. Clara Whitmore understood too. She had stood beside the recovery pen, arms folded, dark hair slipping loose from its tie, pretending not to smile too much while Milo nosed the food, sneezed once, then decided life was worth another bite. Nova watched him with the rigid devotion of a mother who had already lost him once in her mind. Her gray, brown, and cream coat had been cleaned of mud and ice, though the fur still lay rough along her injured shoulder. Clara's bandage wrapped the wound in neat white layers. The mother shepherd remained thin, wary, and too alert for a dog who needed rest. But when Milo crawled back against her belly, Nova lowered her head and touched him with her nose. Not frantic anymore. Counting, still, but not panicking. Ranger lay near the clinic door, large and silent, amber eyes half closed. To anyone else, he might have looked relaxed. Ethan knew better. Ranger was resting the way sentries rested, body quiet, mind awake. Outside, 2 state environmental vehicles remained parked by the curb. Their presence made the town uneasy. Brightwater was a place where news usually traveled in casserole dishes and snowplow gossip. Now men and women in official jackets came and went with sealed evidence bags, tablets, and careful faces. Haven 9 had not vanished. It had become paperwork. That was less poetic, but probably more dangerous. By noon, Ethan met the lead environmental investigator in the clinic parking lot. Her name was Marisol Vance, a woman in her late 40s with copper, brown skin, a compact strong build, and black hair braided tightly beneath a navy winter cap. Her eyes were dark, steady, and difficult to mislead. She wore a state environmental response jacket over insulated field gear, and everything about her suggested she had spent years listening to powerful men explain why regulations did not apply to them. "I read the preliminary logs," she said. Ethan waited. Marisol looked toward the ridge. "You didn't shut it down." "No." "Why?" "Because I didn't know what would fall when the brace came out." She studied him for a moment, then nodded once. "Good answer." It did not sound like praise. It sounded like permission to keep breathing. Miles Ketter sat on the clinic steps a few yards away, elbows braced on knees, old wool cap in his hands. Without it, his brown, gray hair looked thinner, his face more hollow. The former Haven 9 engineer seemed to have aged several years since the core chamber. Guilt did that. Once a man stopped running from it, it caught up all at once. Marisol glanced toward him. He agreed to give a full statement. "He will," Ethan said. "You sound sure." Ethan looked at Miles, who was staring at nothing in particular. He's tired of carrying it alone. Miles had not asked for forgiveness. Ethan respected him for that. Some people wanted forgiveness before truth, as if mercy were a door they could push through without wiping their boots. Miles seemed to understand that the first honest step was not being absolved. It was being useful in the right direction. By late afternoon, Dr. Warren Holt had been transferred out of Brightwater, under state custody. No one in town saw much of him beyond a brief glimpse through the tinted window of an official vehicle. Ethan had watched from the clinic porch as Holt was driven away. The man had not looked afraid. Angry, yes. Offended, certainly. But not ashamed. That stayed with Ethan longer than he wanted it to. There were men who hurt others because they lost themselves. Holt was worse. Holt had known exactly where he stood. He had simply believed everything smaller than his ambition existed to be measured, used, and filed. Ethan thought of Milo's tiny body in the snow, Ranger's newly revealed marker, a 03, a lineage match. He had not told the town that part, not yet. Marisol knew, Clara knew, Miles knew. Ethan had seen the question in Clara's eyes when she glanced at Ranger afterward. What was Ranger before he became yours? And Ranger, being Ranger, offered no explanation beyond stealing half a biscuit from Clara's desk when no one was looking, and then behaving as if the biscuit had volunteered. That, at least, felt like grace. 3 days after Holt's arrest, Milo stood for the first time without leaning against Nova. It happened in the recovery room while snow melted from the clinic roof, in slow silver drops. Ethan had been sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, one knee raised, Ranger beside him. Clara was changing Nova's shoulder dressing. The two stronger pups slept in a warm pile beneath a lamp. Milo woke suddenly. He blinked, sneezed, then pushed himself upright on trembling legs. No one moved. Even Clara froze with the bandage half unrolled in her hand. Milo took one step, then another. His legs wobbled terribly, his head bobbing with effort, but he kept going until he reached Ranger. The tiny puppy pressed his forehead against Ranger's front paw. Ranger lowered his head. For a moment, the old German shepherd and the little survivor remained perfectly still, as though some ancient oath had passed between them. The guardian and the rescued, the witness and the proof. Then Milo tipped sideways and fell gently into Ranger's leg. Clara laughed first, a small broken sound. Then Ethan did too. Nova lifted her head, watched them, and for the first time since Ethan had found her beneath Haven, Nine's shadow, the mother dog's tail moved once against the blanket, just once. But it was enough to make the whole room feel warmer. The days that followed did not heal everything. They only gave the living room to heal. The two stronger puppies were eventually placed with foster families Clara trusted. One went to a retired search and rescue volunteer named Harold Baines, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s with a white beard, windburned cheeks, and hands gentle enough to cradle a sparrow. Harold had lost his old shepherd the previous winter and had sworn he was done with dogs, which everyone in Brightwater knew meant he was one sad, eyed puppy away from lying to himself. The other pup went to Emily Ross, a young widow and former EMT with short auburn hair, pale freckled skin, and the quiet patience of someone who had learned grief did not vanish, but could be given chores. She lived near the lake with her 8-year-old son, and when the pale-eared puppy climbed into the boy's lap, Clara turned away quickly and pretended to check paperwork. Nova watched each goodbye with restrained distress. She licked both pups, pressed her nose to their ears, and paced afterward until Ranger stood beside her. Ethan expected growling resistance, maybe panic. Instead, Nova leaned slightly against Ranger's shoulder. Not trust in the world, trust in one dog. Sometimes that was where healing started. Milo stayed. There had been no real discussion. Clara said he was too weak to place yet. Ethan said he could keep him at the cabin temporarily. Ranger stared at him with the flat patience of an animal, who knew temporary was a human word used when the heart had already lost an argument. Nova stayed too. She's not ready for strangers, Clara said. Ethan nodded. She may never fully be, Clara added. I know. Clara looked at him over the top of her clipboard. You understand this means medication schedules, physical therapy, noise sensitivity work, controlled exposure, follow-up scans, and puppies chewing things you didn't know mattered. Ethan thought of ambushes, night insertions, frozen climbs, live fire, and classified briefings. How bad can chewing be? 3 hours after bringing Milo to the cabin, Ethan found one of his old socks dragged ceremonially beneath the stove, as if offered to a household god of lint. Ranger looked innocent. Milo looked asleep. Nova looked away. Ethan suspected conspiracy. Spring did not arrive all at once. It negotiated. Snow retreated from the south, facing slopes first, exposing dark earth in narrow strips. Water began ticking from the cabin roof in slow rhythms. The lake remained frozen, but its edges softened from white to gray, blue. The pines shed snow in sudden thumps that made Milo jump and Nova flinch, though she recovered faster each time. Ethan kept records.
Not official reports, though Marisol received those too. These were his own handwritten observations, in a black notebook: wind direction, bird movement, snowpack changes, Ranger's reactions, Nova's stress triggers, Milo's appetite, locations where pressure still felt wrong. He did not write to cleanse himself. He wrote because forgetting was how old sins learn to breathe again. Miles visited once a week to help monitor the outer senses. The man moved more slowly now, but his eyes no longer dodged every living thing. Sometimes he stood near Nova's pen on the porch and said nothing. Nova did not approach him. She also no longer growled. Miles accepted that as more mercy than he deserved. Haven 9 remained sealed under state supervision. The system was not destroyed. It was restricted, monitored, reduced in stages, by people who understood caution was not cowardice. Some townspeople wanted it ripped out immediately. Others wanted to pretend nothing had happened. Marisol Vance refused both. Bad systems love extremes, she told Ethan once. Panic and denial. Both make cleanup harder. Ethan liked her for that. He liked people who did not confuse certainty with wisdom. One morning, several weeks after the core adjustment, Ethan walked the ridge trail with Ranger, Nova, and Milo. Milo was not strong enough for a long walk, so Ethan carried him part of the way tucked inside his jacket. The puppy objected to this arrangement with soft grumbles that made Ranger's ears twitch, in what might have been irritation or amusement. Nova walked near Ethan's left side, still thin, still guarded, but no longer looking over her shoulder every few steps. The ridge opened above Brightwater Valley. Below them, the town sat bright beneath thinning snow. Chimneys smoked. The lake caught the morning sun. Far across the pines, the old Haven 9 site was hidden by trees and distance. But Ethan knew where it lay. Some things remained even when unseen. Milo wriggled, demanding the ground. "You sure?" Ethan asked. The puppy answered by licking his chin, with astonishing disrespect. Ethan set him down on a patch of exposed grass. Milo stood, wobbled, then took off in a crooked little run that lasted exactly 6 seconds before he tripped over nothing and rolled onto his side. Ranger walked over and sniffed him. Nova hurried forward, then stopped herself. Milo popped back up, offended by gravity, but otherwise undamaged. Ethan laughed. Not the tired half sound he used to make when something was almost funny. A real laugh. It startled him. For years, he had believed survival meant leaving parts of himself buried where they fell. But perhaps survival was stranger than that. Perhaps it was finding something small and half, frozen in the snow, carrying it home, and discovering that the thing rescued was not only the puppy. Ranger came to stand beside him. Ethan rested a hand on the dog's harness. The black fabric was worn, the red trim faded at the edges. A03. The system had called him. Ethan looked down at him. "You were never theirs," he said quietly. Ranger leaned into his leg. Nova stood over Milo, watching the valley. The wind moved through the pines from the west, steady and honest. Birds crossed above the ridge in a clean line, following some old map written in blood. Wing and weather, long before men built machines beneath the earth. Ethan understood then that responsibility was not the same as control. Control demanded obedience from the world. Responsibility listened when the world answered back. He could not restore every broken thing. Haven 9 would not vanish because he regretted it. Nova would not forget. Milo would always carry some trace of that cold night in his small bones. Ranger's past would remain partly hidden, like a name scratched beneath frost, but Ethan could stay. He could watch the ridge. He could tell the truth. He could draw boundaries around harm and refuse to let silence become another kind of permission. The sun lifted higher, laying gold across the thawing snow. Milo barked once at a clump of grass, brave as a tiny warrior challenging a dragon. Ranger looked deeply unimpressed. Nova's tail moved faintly again. Ethan smiled toward the valley. Sometimes destiny did not arrive with thunder or prophecy. Sometimes it arrived trembling in the snow, small enough to fit inside 2 hands, asking only not to be left behind. And sometimes, if a man was lucky and wounded enough to understand, saving that fragile life became the first honest step toward saving his own.
Sometimes God's miracles do not arrive with thunder. Sometimes they come quietly, trembling in the snow, small enough to fit in 2 hands, waiting for someone to stop, kneel down, and care. This story reminds us that we may not be able to fix everything we have lost. We may not be able to undo every mistake or heal every wound overnight, but with faith, courage, and compassion, we can still choose to do less harm. We can still protect what is fragile. We can still become part of someone else's miracle. In daily life, maybe that miracle is a kind word, a second chance, a rescued animal, a forgiven mistake, or the strength to keep going when the road ahead is unclear. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what moment meant the most to you. And if you believe stories of courage, faith, and loyal animals still matter, please subscribe to the channel. May God bless you, protect your family, guide your steps, and give peace to every heart watching tonight.